Hello, everybody, and welcome. Glad you could make it tonight. Thank you all for joining tonight's annual meeting of the Boston Preservation Alliance. As Allison, you'll be hearing from Allison shortly, but I'm Chris Scoville, the board president, and I am honored to be entering my 5th year. Sorry about that. I wasn't on video. Now I'm on video. I'm honored to be entering my 5th year as the Alliance's board president, and hopefully the last time that we will have to have this meeting virtually. For obvious reasons, we're still not the best with technology. It's almost become cliche at this point to refer to how much change the Alliance has been undergoing, but there's really no other way to describe it. We have so much to share with you tonight, including a tribute to the late Susan Park, our beloved founder and former president, some exciting updates on our work, and a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation with some Q&A in breakout rooms afterwards. But before we begin the program, as you know, Greg Gaylor has departed our organization after serving at the helm for nearly a decade. Greg leaves us on the best of terms, and in fact, will be remaining in the preservation family, leading the Association for Preservation Technology. Greg also leaves the Alliance stronger in every way possible. As you'll hear during the program, our financial condition is the strongest it's been in our over 40-year history. Our voice is louder, our reach is further, and our ability to engage with stakeholders in meaningful conversations and be an agent of change is growing. Just as importantly, Greg has also led us down a path to be a better organization, paving the way for us to be more involved at the neighborhood level, becoming a more inclusive organization that shares the stories of people, buildings, and communities that the preservation community has for far too long overlooked. So thank you to Greg for his nearly decade-long service. Greg, you will be forever a dear friend to this organization and a friend to me. While Greg's departure was a bittersweet occasion, I'm proud to report that our leadership transition has been smooth and caused no disruption to our operation. Shortly after Greg informed us of his upcoming transition, the board appointed another nearly decade-long veteran of the Alliance, Allison Frazee, as acting executive director, while the board implemented a transition plan that included the formation of a selection committee. Up until that point, Allison had been serving as our assistant director and had previously served as our director of advocacy and outreach coordinator. Allison is in her 9th year with the organization now. Allison, at the time of Greg's notice, expressed her interest in being considered for the executive director role on a permanent basis. And after the selection committee carefully weighed its options, as well as the pros and cons of embarking on a larger search, made the recommendation, which passed unanimously this March 15th, that Allison be offered the position of executive director on a permanent basis. So it is with great pleasure and without further delay that I introduce you to our new executive director, Allison Frazee.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've been staff at the Alliance, as Chris said, for almost 9 years now, so this isn't my first event, but it's my first as the executive director, which makes it a very special night for me, and I'm happy to share it with all of you. I'm honored to take on this leadership role, and I deeply appreciate the support I've received from the board, my colleagues here in Boston, and peers all across the country. I look forward to working with everyone here tonight as we continue to grow our network, learn from each other, and find new ways to tell the stories of Bostonians. Preservation has a long history in this country. The work that's been done by those who came before us has saved countless places that connect us with our past and laid a groundwork for those of us who continue that work. But the way that we think about preservation is evolving, and the tools and policies that make preservation possible must change too. The Alliance has been active in Boston for over 40 years, and while we have contributed to the preservation of some of Boston's most treasured places, we are also embracing this moment of growth and showing leadership. The challenge laid before me to expand our definition of preservation and make room at the table for other voices wouldn't have been possible without those who laid the strong foundation of this organization. Recently, we had to say goodbye to one of our founders, a landmark in Boston and an inspiration of mine, Susan Park. Roger Tackett, a close friend of Susan's, is going to share a few words about her impact on the city and all of us who continue her legacy.
All right. Thank you, Allison, for the handoff, and hopefully I will take up the mantle well. Good evening, friends. I am grateful to be with you tonight to share some thoughts about the Boston Preservation Alliance's North Star, Susan Park. For all of us who knew her, Susan Calhoun Pun Park was an inspired leader and simply a force of nature. She devoted her life to bringing all of us together, most often in the service of making Boston, the city she so loved, the best that it could be, without ever expecting anything in return. Susan was one of the founders of the Alliance, but more importantly, for decades, she served as the chair of our board and, in fact, was our center of gravity. For so many of us, Susan simply swept us up in her passion, her uncompromising integrity, and her indefatigably exhausting energy, dedicated to making our city a better place. Susan's leadership in preserving Boston's rich heritage spanned more than half a century. Many of us who had the privilege of working with her, or better yet, simply trying to keep up with her, committed to carrying on the important work that she began. My wife, Marion, and I are most often reminded of our endearing friendship with Susan when we stroll the streets of our elegant city and reflect upon the literally hundreds of stories, building by building, block by block. Each one of those stories represented yet another preservation challenge, and sometimes a long and protracted fight to save another important piece of Boston's built environment and its landmark architecture. As citizens of the Athens of America, we have inherited a wonderful gift, and ensuring that our historic buildings are preserved, restored, and most importantly, as Allison just referenced, reimagined for our future is still our mission. I'd like to share with you just a few examples of the accomplishments of the BPA under Susan's determined leadership. Our city has nearly a dozen magnificent historic theaters, including the Opera House, the Cutler Majestic, and the Paramount. All of these were slated for the wrecking ball. Most had been vacant for years, and a few had been open to the elements for decades. Today, with the BPA as the catalyst, they have all been fully restored and are the shining cultural icons of our city's vibrant theater district. The restoration of these landmark buildings is almost as consequential as the productions that once again flourish within them, hopefully to be enjoyed for generations to come. For years, we were continually told that Fenway Park was outdated, unsafe, and most importantly, uneconomical. Susan and the BPA were determined not to give in to this foregone conclusion, that this ball field of legend was just a relic of a bygone era, and it had to be demolished and replaced by a shiny new domed stadium. We engaged with the powers to be for years, and finally, working with the developer, Fenway was reimagined. Today, for many families who come from around the country and the world, experiencing the legacy of Fenway Park and the Green Monster is as meaningful as watching our beloved Red Sox play and hopefully win. And finally, the grand Art Deco United Shoe Building, the waterworks at the Chestnut Hill Reservoir, the Liberty Hotel, formerly known as the Charles Street Jail, and scores of other buildings remain as a part of Boston's fabric because Susan inspired us to never, ever give in. Susan was a woman ahead of her time who forged a path of respect, which made her a force with which to be reckoned. For those of us who worked with her, she not only led our efforts, but schooled us well in her tradecraft. When last we spoke, knowing full well that her time was limited, Susan shared her thoughts like a proud parent about all of us at the Alliance and what we had accomplished together. She was confident that the BPA was well positioned for an even more consequential and exciting future. And just for the record, Susan was over the moon about Allison becoming our new executive director. As if her tireless efforts on behalf of the Alliance wouldn't have been enough, Susan also founded Harborfest and for decades served on several other nonprofit boards, including, most especially, her beloved South End Historical Society, Hayes Park, and being appointed as a Boston Parks and Recreation Commissioner. Whether going toe-to-toe with a succession of mayors or planting thousands and thousands of bulbs in our city's parks, Susan's was a life well lived. For those of you who knew her, our lives were enriched by her grace and friendship, and our city is forever a much better place because of her tireless efforts. Kind friend and mentor, may we continue to be inspired by the example you set. We love you, Susan. And now to Allison.
Actually, you're getting Chris again. Allison's up next. So we are going to move on to the business part of the meeting. We'll get through this fairly quickly. I would now like to officially call the 2022 annual meeting of the Boston Preservation Alliance to order. The first order of business is to approve the minutes of the 2021 meeting, which you should see on your screen, and to accept these minutes. We're going to use the chat to hopefully get a motion and a second, and then you will see a voting button on your screen so we can vote on that. So if I can get, there we go. We got a motion and a second. Thank you. Please, yep, there it is. Please fill out the poll there. It's a pretty easy question. Give it a few more seconds so we get as many people as we can. Okay. I think we are there. The motion carries. Thank you. The Alliance benefits from a dedicated board of directors that give their time and support to our work in so many ways, technically, professionally, and financially. Their commitment to our mission propels the organization forward, especially over the past year as we advanced our DEI training in partnership with YW Boston and thoughtfully considered the future of the Alliance. This year, we have one outgoing director, Carl J. Carl has been on the board for an astounding 22 years with unwavering service to the Alliance. As one of the leading technical experts on our board, Carl has always made himself available for guidance on projects. He's also been an instrumental contributor to our fundraising efforts over the years. His calm demeanor and supportive approach has guided the Alliance through over 2 decades of growth. As Carl looks forward to a very well-earned retirement, we want to take this time to thank him for all he has given to the Alliance and to the city of Boston. Now it's time to vote on the board slate that you see on the screen. As a reminder, our directors are elected for 3-year terms. As we continue to examine our internal processes, we decided to temporarily delay the invitation of new board members to join us in 2021 while we continue our DEIA work in partnership with YW Boston. You can see that there. Okay. So can someone please make a motion in the chat to approve this slate of candidates for board of directors? And we'll also need a second. Okay, I see those. Thank you. And we'll go to the vote. Okay, it looks like we're there. The motion carries. Congratulations. And I am now going to turn things over to Sean Geary, our treasurer, for a brief financial report.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Geary. I'm the treasurer of the Alliance. And as you just heard from earlier from our board president, Chris Squivel, I am pleased to confirm that 2021 was a banner year for the organization. And that extends to our financial well-being as well. So we've entered 2022 with the strongest balance sheet in the history of the Alliance, including our reserve accounts. We stand at roughly $750,000, providing a very strong foundation for the Alliance going forward. This is due to the continued robust financial support that we've received through our peer-to-peer fundraising campaign in the spring, through our awards in the fall, and into year-end giving through our annual fund. So I'll take a moment here to acknowledge the hard work put in by our staff, the board, and especially the development committee, all of who have worked so hard to strengthen the Alliance's financial position. So now to the numbers. For 2021, our total income was just under $750,000 and expenses $534,000, as you see broken down here on screen. I'll point out that over 2/3 of our income relies on fundraising and individual contributions from members. For comparison to our budget, our approved 2021 budget has a financial deficit with expectations that expenses would modestly go up with a planned expenditure of $520,000. So fairly on budget for that component, but then also subdued income projections with a budget of $453,000 that reflected the uncertainty of the future, given that at the end of 2020, we were still entrenched in the pandemic and couldn't quite know what was to come. So while again, we were on budget for expenses, the income projections underappreciated our fundraising efforts, as well as the addition of a second round of the Paycheck Protection Program, leading to the surplus of $214,000 that you see reported here today. That concludes the financial report for 2021, and Ariana will take it from here to talk about the YAs.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share news from the Young Advisors tonight. The YAs finished 2021 strong with a full board, including 5 new members with new perspectives to offer. Our first occasion of the year was our annual heart bombing event in February. We usually come together at a local bar or restaurant to create Valentines and temporarily post them at a threatened building, which helps boost awareness of the site. However, since in-person indoor events were out of question last winter, we made the event about the entire neighborhood of Fort Hill, and we took our Valentines on a walk through the area. During Preservation Month in May, we created a scavenger hunt for the first time to bring visitors to a historic neighborhood outside the city center. We chose East Boston, which has a wealth of shipping and immigration-related history. We selected a number of particularly interesting sites and buildings to highlight on our self-guided walking tour, which we created using a new app called the AIA Guide to Boston. Participants were led to a prize box containing beautiful stickers designed by a member of our board. In the fall, we used our research on East Boston to hold a group walking tour through the neighborhood. Despite the continuing pandemic, we managed to hold our annual Libations for Preservation event in person last August. Health and safety had us holding LFP on a boat this year, and the change turned out to be very popular. We cruised the harbor, enjoying cocktails and views of historic buildings from the water, and we raised almost $12,000 for the Alliance through raffle tickets, sponsorships, and ticket sales. We are looking forward to another nautical LFP this summer. A few months earlier in May, we will host Preservation Month, an event that will combine one of Boston's gay bars and a series of short presentations on local LGBTQ history. Thank you very much for your attention, and we hope to see you in 2022.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you to all of our young advisors for your dedication to the organization. Thank you for all you do to advance our mission. Before we get to our guest speaker tonight, I want to take a few minutes to share some highlights from our advocacy work. Despite the ongoing pandemic last year, Boston buzzed with new development proposals and preservation work, which kept all of us at the Alliance very busy. The Alliance engaged in over 100 projects and initiatives in 2021. We worked with Councillor Bach to advance a home rule petition related to landmarking, which is our strongest tool for preservation. Currently, only those resources which are proven to have historic significance beyond the local level, so at the state, regional, or national level, qualify for consideration as a local landmark. The proposed language change would allow Boston to protect historic resources that are important to Bostonians, creating a more accessible and equitable process for all our neighborhoods. Look for more information on this important petition later this year as it advances through the State House. We also testified at City Council to advocate for an increase in budget for the Boston Landmarks Commission so that they have the staff and resources to be more effective in our historic districts and in collaboration with other city agencies and advocates. While we were successful in gaining funding for the department, we will continue to push for a more robust preservation presence within local government. In collaboration with our climate advocacy partners, we supported efforts to advance a new carbon calculator tool by applying for and being awarded a grant from the Mo Family Fund to make that critical carbon calculator tool available to the public online. If you're interested in learning more about that tool, there will be a presentation in April by the creators of the calculator. So see our website for more information about registration. Over the past year, we have worked closely with our peers across the country at the National Preservation Partners Network on climate action, such as advancing the understanding that building reuse is climate action, and several other nationwide preservation priorities. We were able to share our experiences in Boston and learn how other cities are mitigating things like rising sea levels and flooding, policies created for deconstruction and salvage of historic buildings, and measures to manage deferred maintenance and demolition by neglect. We're working to create an online database for policies and case studies so that advocates and decision makers across the country can share knowledge and experience as we work together to protect the nation's historic fabric and vibrant communities. Here in Boston, we focused on dozens of projects, including Amrheins, an iconic historic building in South Boston. A new proposal threatened this anchor building at a key corner on West Broadway. While there was an outpouring of support for preservation, some in the neighborhood endorsed demolition. We worked with other advocates, elected officials, and BPDA staff to ensure that at least the outer facades of the historic building will be restored and incorporated into a new project on the site. We also continued our advocacy in the West End, working with our West End and Beacon Hill partners to express ongoing concerns about the MGH Clinical Services building proposal. As you'll hear more about from our guest speaker, the West End was almost entirely razed by urban renewal practices, and only a handful of buildings remain today from the old neighborhood. MGH's proposal requires the demolition of 3 surviving historic buildings that you see on your screen. Though the project is moving forward, as a result of dozens of conversations with MGH and other stakeholders, mitigation from the project will support several local preservation organizations, including the Legacy Fund for Boston, a new funding resource for historic preservation that the Alliance initiated. We're expecting this new fund to launch this year, and we'll be able to share more information about how to apply pretty soon. Our communications expert, Matthew Dickey, launched a new program last year in partnership with Boston Public Schools and 60 middle school students. Matthew felt that too often stories about Boston are told by adults for adults, so he wanted to hear from these young students, many of whom are immigrants to Boston, about the places that matter in their neighborhoods. Matthew, the students, and their teachers toured Dorchester's Grove Hall, Upham's Corner, and Fields Corner neighborhoods. We're tasked with interviewing business owners, artists, and residents, and writing biographies about the people and places that make Dorchester unique. Their stories will be published as a deck of cards and paired with a map, allowing anyone to explore and learn about the local landmarks identified by our next generation of urban curators. This is only a sample of the work that we do day in and day out at the Alliance, made possible by the generous support of our members and donors like you. To keep up with our advocacy efforts, check out our website for project updates, follow us on social media, and be sure you're receiving our e-news with information about our work, our partners and supporters, and preservation news from Boston and around the country. And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Tonight we have with us Adam Paul Susaneck, who recently received his Master's of Architecture from the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. His work focuses on addressing historic inequity and ongoing climate issues through urban planning, architecture, and transportation infrastructure. In his professional work, he has been involved in the retrofitting and upgrading of New York City subway and commuter rail stations for ADA accessibility. His work has been featured in San Francisco's Exploratorium, the Oakland Museum of California, the Queens Museum, as well as in the popular urbanist news site Streets Blog. Hailing from West Palm Beach, Florida originally, Adam received his BA in political science at UC Berkeley. As Adam shares his presentation tonight, if you think of any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll get them to them at the end. After our meeting closes, we'll invite all of those who are still interested in continuing tonight's conversation to hop over to a different Zoom, and we'll have breakout rooms where you can talk to Adam, talk to our young advisors, or talk to Alliance staff with any questions you might have. And now it's time for our guest speaker, Adam. Over to you.
Hey, thank you very much for the introduction. Let me just get set up. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Let me just get into segregation. Okay, so hello. Thank you very much, Allison, for the introduction, and congratulations. And thank you to the BPA for having me. So I'm Adam Susaneck. So just very quickly, as I go through this presentation, I'm going to be using the mouse to sort of point out certain things. So for instance, here's the wrecking ball in this image. I run the project Segregation by Design. You might be familiar with it on Instagram or Twitter. But so the project, I'm basically trying to show the effect of various policies on the American city. One of the primary inspirations for the project was Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. And I'm trained as an architect. And one of the things I found frustrating was just there weren't enough pictures. So for those of you who have read that book, I intend this almost as like a visual supplement, but to some extent more. So I'll get started. So, oops. So in today's presentation, I'm planning on talking about Boston, but talking about the American city more generally. And this is an image of Detroit in 1955 versus 2021. So I'm going to be discussing sort of how we got from this top image, a dense, walkable, transit-based city, to what we have today, which is a sprawling, suburban, automobile-based city. And I'll make this presentation available after the meeting tonight. The reason I show this slide is to say that there's the timeline of segregation is long, of residential segregation in the United States is long, and there's many facets to it, but it can be, what I'm saying is to some extent, it can be boiled down to this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates saying, "It is increasingly clear to me that white flight was not a mystical process for which we have no real explanation or understanding. White flight was the policy of our federal, state, and local governments. That policy held that Americans should enjoy easy access to the cities via the automobile and live in suburbs without Black people who by their very nature degrade property and humanity." So to be very reductionist, what I'm going to be talking about today is the effect of, so he says, white flight is the policy of our federal, state, and local government. In particular, I'm going to be talking about two laws. That's the 1949 Federal Housing Act and the 1956 Federal Highway Act. So many of the images I'm going to be showing are just for, if I don't do an adequate job of explaining them in the moment, just know that they're generally projects that were funded by one of these two bills. So for instance, this is the Central Artery cutting through downtown Boston in the 50s, a project which of course displaced over 20,000 people. So again, these are more images of that same project. So I'll be sort of reading over these images and know, again, this is part of that same project, and keep those two laws in mind. Again, 49 Housing Act and 56 Highway Act. So you can actually see on this image here from the West End, they talk about that funding source right here. But so during the mid to late 20th century, using the policies of residential redlining, automobile-focused urban renewal, and regional freeway planning as funded by those two bills, the United States federal government financed an unprecedented reshaping of the American city, specifically and significantly impacting the racial composition of municipalities across the country. By encouraging suburban white flight from historic city centers through automobile-focused transportation policy, while simultaneously limiting the mobility and options of non-white residents through racist housing policies. These laws, again, the two that I mentioned, radically altered the American urban landscape. The repercussions of these policies continue to this day, reflected in both the built form and socioeconomic conditions of the inner city neighborhoods and suburbs alike. Excuse me. So this project aims to investigate these policies, prove that they were written and implemented with specific racially motivated intent, and to document how they were actualized on the ground, and to analyze the lasting effects they have today. So this on the left here is an aerial image of Boston in 1938. And another, just before I get going too far, another administrative thing is what I do with this project is I colorize historic imagery, including orthographic aerial imagery like this for the purpose of clarity. It makes it pop. It makes it a lot more understandable for a modern audience. And quite frankly, it's a lot of fun. So this is Boston, 1938 versus 1974. So on the right here, what I've highlighted is the federally funded projects from those two bills, except for Starro Drive, which was state. But we can talk about that later if people have questions specifically about Starro. But again, what I've highlighted here is projects funded by those two bills in Boston. So for instance, you can see the West End here, downtown, the potato offloading things, that's very specific. The New York streets and Roxbury. So these policies created a tectonic shift in the underlying spatial reasoning of American cities, pulling labor and capital from historic downtowns to newly built suburbs and exurbs, both taking advantage of and amplifying economic trends of urban deindustrialization and automobile-based suburbanization. These laws changed the relationship of the periphery with the center in cities all across the nation. In fact, it was common in planning documents to stop referring to central business districts as CBDs and start referring to them actually as central parking districts. And again, it's using those two bills, the 49 Housing Act and the 56 Federal Highway Act, that basically the federal government provided the largest 180 municipalities with basically a carte blanche to remake their neighborhoods and transportation systems. Using these novel and generous funding mechanisms, cities dramatically altered their built form on a scale previously only seen either in natural disasters or war, with the exception of Haussmann's Paris, but many of the planners were actually specifically inspired by that. So explicitly baked into these policies were discriminatory practices. So what you see here is a redlining map. So as part of, this happened earlier, but during the New Deal, as part of these policies, the HOLC, which was an arm of the Federal Housing Administration, created maps of every single city, grading each neighborhood based on race. So explicitly baked into these policies were discriminatory practices, which systematically disadvantaged communities of color and facilitated a spatial segregation of cities. Neighborhoods were neighborhoods were graded for investment worthiness based on racial composition. And that is made very clear in the comments. So what this is showing, this is Oakland, California. This is showing some of the comments. They were very explicit about why they graded certain neighborhoods certain ways. And you can see Boston's redlining map here. So the effect of redlining was to devastate property values and enervate tax bases of integrated and racially diverse neighborhoods, subsequently reducing basic public services and maintenance, and driving away all but those with no choice but to stay, which ultimately were people of color denied any housing outside of redlined areas, because another common practice at the time was the restrictive covenant, which made it so that these new suburbs were whites only, specifically written into the deeds. So you can see this is DC. These next couple images are just showing that these policies had massive effects on many cities, not just Boston. So you can see here, this is Southeast DC. This is, I believe, 32, and then this was 48. So this Southwest. Southwest was largely African-American and Jewish neighborhood, residential, and it was totally demolished in just after World War II. with the creation of I-95, now 395, and the building of various federal buildings. And again, I mean, this is DC, so it's obviously federally funded, but these were funded by those same policies. This is Providence, Rhode Island, the traditionally African-American neighborhood of Mount Auburn was totally demolished and replaced with a USPS sorting facility. In addition, 95 cut through many of the inner city residential neighborhoods. And this is an image showing the effect that redlining continues to have today in terms of the racial makeup of cities. So this is on the left, an image of the redlining map of Buffalo, New York, overlaid on an aerial image from 1927. And then this is the census data from 2010. And you can see that it still pretty neatly matches, for all intents and purposes, yellow and red. That's what I mean by redlining. And then green and blue are the higher, the quote unquote, higher graded areas. And you can see that they're still today mostly white. And then the mostly redlined areas are Hispanic and African-American today. So this is back to Boston, the West End. This is an image I colorized from 1955 versus 1959, showing the destruction of the West End. So urban renewal and slum clearance projects were often coupled with highway projects so that they could take advantage of dual funding streams from both the 49 and the 56 bills. And they targeted, again, these downtown neighborhoods. So displaced white residents from these neighborhoods were lured to newly built racially restricted suburbs with new highways, as well as generously federally subsidized mortgages, while displaced non-white residents were either shunted to new public housing projects, of which there were not built enough, or simply given no assistance at all. And downtown inner city neighborhoods were the most common target. So this is Roxbury. So again, the West End, Roxbury met a similar fate. This is the Washington Park Urban Renewal Program. This is the government planning document showing the clearance sections, and you can see the effect that it had. So these neighborhoods became especially vulnerable targets after World War II, and the Second Great Migration made it so that during which many African Americans emigrated from the South, looking for jobs in northern factories during World War II. That exacerbated racial tensions in redlined areas. So many of these downtown old neighborhoods became targets, specifically because they were often home to a multiracial working class combination of, again, African-American and Puerto Rican internal immigrants, European immigrants, et cetera. And largely due to their integrated nature and subsequent labeling as slums, historic and storied neighborhoods around the country were leveled, replaced with high-rise residential projects, commercial facilities for suburban commuters, or simply parking. So again, this is an example in Roxbury. And what happened here was there was a plan for a freeway to go through that was opposed by residents, and actually they were able to organize and stop the building of the freeway, which is a rare story around the country, told very well in Carolyn Crockett's book, People Before Highways. But these neighborhoods were leveled, basically, replaced with institutional uses. So, for instance, this is Dudley Square, now Nubian Square in Roxbury. This church, built in the 1830s, I believe, was demolished, replaced with the Boston parking lot for the Boston Police Department. And in some cases, buildings, this is the Warren Hotel. It was a residential hotel, so not what we think of as a hotel, but people live there. This building in Roxbury was seized in the Washington Park urban renewal program under eminent domain, demolished, and then rather than even turned over to institutional uses, as in the case with this lot, this one was simply sold back to a private developer who just built a parking lot. And to the point, Boston has a very rich history, and if folks have questions about it, I'm going kind of long, of freeway protests, and they were able to stop the worst of it from happening, and other cities weren't. So again, if folks have questions about that, feel free. But moving on to the next point, what I'm showing here is, on the left, this is an image of Boston's transportation system in 1938, public transportation system. And then on the right, this is the map of today. So I'll explain this in a second. But so these policies of urban renewal and freeway planning, redlining, they were explicitly targeted at communities of color. But the so-called collateral damage from them has deeply affected the entire American populace and its relationship with the city. In its drive to segregate, the communal public goods like transportation, public space, and public amenities were dismantled and privatized, with compounding effects on the nature of the American public realm as a whole. So in her recent book, political strategist Heather McGhee, the book is called The Sum of Us. She uses an example of what she calls drained pool politics to illustrate this point. So in the 1930s, during the New Deal, the federal government financed the building of grand beaux-arts, generally public swimming pools in cities across the nation. And the pools were officially whites only. So 2 decades later, when the Supreme Court ordered municipalities to racially integrate and desegregate the pools, many of the cities, to avoid doing so, they specifically said this, drain the pools and demolish them. And subsequently, there was a boom in the construction of backyard swimming pools in single-family homes. And the point I'm making here with this image is, to some extent, cities across the nation did so with public transportation. Boston, luckily, avoided the worst of it. You're not Buffalo or Houston, which entirely dismantled, but the effect and what has happened was the complete dismantling of local electric rail, as well as a refocus of rapid transit lines to suburbs rather than inner city neighborhoods. So for instance, and I know there's a lot we can talk about with this, but for instance, the rerouting of the Orange Line around Roxbury through the cleared land for the Southwest corridor. And I know there's many reasons why that might have happened that we can discuss later. But the fact of the matter is that the Orange Line was rerouted around Roxbury and towards a more suburban focus. This is Dudley Station in Roxbury. And you know, there's the idea that it was sort of an eyesore, but that to me seems maybe like a lack of imagination on the part of planners at the time, because around the world, elevated rail has been embraced and modernized. But the Orange Line aside, the point being is that this sort of refocus of the downtown from being, again, a central business district to being a sort of central parking district, and the refocus of who the city was for is one of the main points of the project. And that's why I talk about examples, for instance, here of the Charles River Esplanade being turned into a freeway. And in addition, the destruction of many of, and I know this is obviously folks in this group are familiar, but the destruction of many of Boston's most storied public spaces, for instance, Scollay Square, seen here in the early 1900s, Adams Square, seen at the same time, and of course, Haymarket Square, which was completely destroyed. So looking forward and sort of talking about today, redlining was outlawed in 1968, but many of the sort of engineering and city planning practices that have their provenance in the policies of redlining are still basically the default policies today. When there's a trap, this is a freeway widening project in Los Angeles. Caltrans is planning on demolishing 259 houses as well as several schools and one park to widen I-5. And this is primarily Hispanic neighborhood. So we're still making the same mistakes as the past. And it's because, you know, there's a reason this was built in this place in the first place. And it's because it was the red line neighborhood and that the land was cheaper artificially. So this is Houston, where they're planning on taking out over 1,000 units of housing, including 486 units of public housing to increase one of their highways to be as wide as the Katy freeway, which is seen here. So they're trying to get this to be as wide as this, doubling down on the mistakes of the past that they know have continued to fail them, given especially recent weather events. In addition, the effect of these policies isn't just what gets built, it's what does not get built. This is a recently canceled, well, it's not recently at this point, it was canceled about 7 years, a while ago, a light rail project through central Baltimore that would have reconnected several formerly red line neighborhoods, mimicking what was formerly a very busy streetcar route that was ripped out. But this line was canceled, and the funding was redistributed to suburban Annapolis. And one of the points about this one is that the divestment in transit infrastructure has been so significant that we've lost a lot of institutional knowledge on even how to build these things in the first place. So it's very easy for a governor, in this case Larry Hogan, to say it's going to be a boondoggle because the price is going to skyrocket, because it very well might, because we've lost sort of a lot of institutional knowledge in terms of rail transit. But that's it's getting a little specific. And in addition, these policies can be seen in just the sort of lack of imagination of projects around the country. This is Providence. They were trying to stitch back together their historic downtown, which was divided by, I forget, I think it was 95, maybe. This is 95. It was a spur. And they did so by, they demolished the bridge, but they simply rebuilt another bridge around the downtown, creating a new wall. So it's sort of a lack of imagination. And then I'm going to show a video really quickly. I'm almost finished. So this video here is just an overview, a before and after of freeway and urban renewal in Boston. And then it dips back down into the big dig. And then I'll make a point about the big dig and then wrap up. So again, what's happening here is this is 1938 versus 1973. So you're seeing the highway go through and take out various neighborhoods. So again, it's sort of a reorienting of downtown from being a self-contained thing to being sort of a commercial space for suburban people to be able to drive in and out of easily. So then this is the big dig. So the point there is that I, to some extent, view the Big Dig is similar to this Providence project. It's a lot better in a lot of ways, but to some extent, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because it is ultimately widening a lot of the highways and to some extent reaffirming the automobile as a primary unit of transportation in downtown, which is geometrically not really possible, and obviously has a fraught history. So what I would say is a more successful example is something like Rochester, which has a very similar history, a downtown that is very transit focused. Actually, Rochester, fun fact, is the only city in the world that I'm aware of that has a subway system that they abandoned. So that's not a great accolade for them, but it is what happened. And they similarly reoriented the spatial logic of downtown around a sort of orbital freeway, and it was disastrous. But what they've done recently is they've started not just, they didn't bury it, they demolished it, and they got rid of it. Now it's a little different because this isn't it's not as busy of a highway as the central artery was, but there's questions of induced demand, and that's a whole different issue. But ultimately, removal is probably the way forward. There's great examples in Seoul and in Germany, or in Seoul, Korea, as well as Hanover in Germany. I'm going to stop there. This is a big old list of sources. For more information, if you can put your phone on the screen on that QR code. Who would have thought QR codes were going to come back? But that's what happened. But you can find more information on everything I've talked about on the site, about the other cities as well I've covered, as the other cities that I've covered. And again, this is a big old list of sources that I will make available to everyone as well as this presentation. So that is that.